Okay, we're going to kick off. There'll be some people shuffling around, I suspect, even now, since we've got a bit of a split site thing going on here. I'm Nigel Shadbolt. I'm Principal of Jesus College, also a Professor in Computer Science here in Oxford, and I am delighted to be talking today with Matt Clifford. Matt, co-founder and chair of Entrepreneur First, chair of the UK's Advanced Research and Invention Agency, ARIA, and author of the UK government's AI Opportunities Action Plan. It's wonderful to have his experience, expertise, and insights here today. He helped, of course, prep the UK's 2023 AI Safety Summit that was held at Bletchley, and later served as the PM's advisor on AI. So, well, I know, Matt, I've got tons of questions to try and elicit. So I'm going to go back to a kind of a beginning. Matt, you read medieval history at Cambridge.
The ideal preparation for
preparation of the mind, life of the mind. And then you kind of went to MIT as a Kennedy scholar, I think, and were studying computational statistics.
That's right.
So I'm just fascinated about that transition. What was it in that kind of, that move from undergrad to grad? Because that often preoccupies a lot of the students I have here.
Well, you know, this has made me a real advocate, I have to say. I don't know if this is heresy to say this in Oxford, but of the American system of being able to dabble during your undergrad. Because in a way, one of the defining turning points in my life was that the Cambridge history curriculum, I think, has not been updated in about 150 years. I may be wrong, but
it advances one gravestone at a time.
Very much. But some maverick in the department in 2006 or whatever decided to put on a course called History by Numbers, and they never ran it again, by the way. So it was clearly a failed experiment. But it was basically like, oh, history has produced a lot of data. Yeah. What would it look like to, kind of take a data-first approach to studying history? And I'd always, one of the weird things about the UK system is that you have to choose so early what you want to do. So although I'd chosen to do history, most of my time at school, I'd really been into maths. That's what I cared about. So I was like, oh, well, this will be fun. And I just got super into it. And, it was like, it was just, it reminded me how much I loved that side of things. And so I was very fortunate to get a Kennedy scholarship, not least because they provide the funding. And the other thing about the US university system is if you have funding, they kind of don't care what you're going to do as long as someone else is paying. And so I think MIT's generally, sort of would never have let me in to do what I did if I'd applied for funding. But I had the funding, and so they didn't really ask any questions. And so that was my pivot into this world.
Really interesting. And you've been coding, as you say, from way before getting into your undergraduate. So, and there are,
sadly, of course, none of the stuff people use today. I was a Visual Basic guy.
Starting in those sorts of ways, don't you worry? I remember kind of hacking away on some Sinclair kind of machine, in Basic as well, I think. So there are many routes into AI, and often quite a few of the folk I know have run that through research labs. Yours kind of came through talent investing. I mean, what are moments at McKinsey, your early kind of entrepreneur first cohorts, nudged you, if you like, from general tech into backing AI founders, having that particular interest there? I mean,
I would say one general thing and one specific thing. So the general thing is, I was 25 when we started EF, and in retrospect, if I met a 25-year-old today wanting to start a venture capital firm, I'd be like, you idiot. No, I generally think 25-year-olds can and should start businesses, but venture capital firms would not be my recommendation of where to start. Mainly because, actually VC is a very network-heavy business. Yeah. And it's, the clue's in the name, it's a very capital-heavy business, and really the bottleneck is, can you raise the money? And Alice, my co-founder, and I started without either of those things. And as a result, it just took us probably longer than it should have. But one thing it forced us to do was, one, we didn't know anything, so we did everything from first principles, which is sometimes a mistake and sometimes good. But the good thing it forced us to do...
But you don't know what you can't do.
You don't know what you can't do. So, and also, I think if we'd explained EF, anyone who knew anything about venture capital, they'd have said, well, that's impossible. You can't build companies from scratch. You can't fund people before they have companies. You can't fund people who don't have teams. You can't put co-founders together. And that was all the conventional wisdom. And there's good reasons why people thought that.
Yeah.
But it meant that we tried it versus not trying it. But the other thing we did was we didn't really have any theses about what we should invest in, other than we wanted to invest in really, really smart people. And that came out of like, at McKinsey, we were surrounded by smart people, but they were all sort of getting really, really good at the PowerPoint shortcuts, which didn't feel like the pinnacle of life's meaning. In a lot of ways, and maybe people disagree. And so, the motivation of starting EF was like, what would it look like if these people who are surrounding us were not just getting really good at that, but actually building things? And so what we did was we came to places like Oxford and Cambridge and Imperial, and we really just went around and said to everyone we could meet, who's the smartest person here? And eventually you'd converge on a small number of names. And then you say, well, what are they working on? And one of the things that I've come to believe very strongly is that it's really hard to predict the future of technology. It's incredibly hard. But to the extent that you can, it probably comes from just following the talent. Like the people bottom up who are working in labs will tend to gravitate towards, especially the young people who haven't yet got any sunk cost in any one research agenda. And so we just got very lucky that was our method. And this was 2012, 2013. And so we started to gravitate to people who were like, this deep learning thing looks like it might actually finally work. So that's the general. The specific thing, real turning point in my life, is a guy came into our office in 2013, clutching this printout of an academic paper. It's like, you've got to read this, it's going to change everything. And I have to say, usually when this happens, it's like, it's perpetual motion, or it's time travel, or it's like, it's not going to change everything. Total crackpot. But this was the AlexNet paper, and he was right. It really did change everything in a lot of ways. It was the start of the modern AI era, you could argue. Or at least it was the start of, I think, recognizing that those ideas around, kind of neural networks might work if we had enough compute, and that maybe there was a path to that. And so we just started hoovering up that talent, and that turned out to be a good time to do that. And a bunch of our investing success came from backing people out of Imperial, out of Oxford, out of Cambridge, who were working in that space. And this was before they were making $100 million a year at Meta or whatever. So
ruthlessly meritocratic. You're looking for real talent, and that's your slogan in a way. You back people before, almost before ideas. But
before ideas.
What signals to you that someone can actually build AI? I mean, does the one naturally follow? I mean, do you have to do?
Well, I think one thing that's very striking in our data set is that it is extremely rare for someone to go from not building to building. And so what we look for is, even if it's not in the same domain, even if it's not the same scale, there's got to be some track record of just an itch to build. So, one way we think about it a lot is we love taking people who've come out of an academic path in AI, but have this series of sort of side hustles, even if they're not AI. Because I think that itch to build combined with the technical skill is a really, really good predictor.
That's a really interesting point. So, and if you look at the AI companies that, EF has kind of created, and that have created real economic value. What do these teams get right?
I would say three big things. One is they fall in love with the customer, not the technology. And almost to invert your question, when great teams go wrong, it's usually the inverse has happened. Heads down, build for ages, no one wants it. So that's the first big thing they get right. The second thing, which is related, is they are not precious about where the technology comes from. So I think one mistake that a lot of companies made, especially those that were sort of unlucky enough to start just before, the sort of transformer revolution and just before the GPT series started to work, is there were a lot of people who were like, oh yeah, that's going to be kind of fine, but we've got our own proprietary stuff and it's better, and that's just such a disaster. If you start to be like, well, the point of our company is the very specific thing we do, rather than the capability to serve a real customer. I think that's
I have to
fatal.
say, speaking against my tribe, that in a sense, that is what I do observe, and perhaps even in my own practice as an academic researcher, you get so fixated on your solution space that you forget that actually where the market could be adjacent to what you're doing, or you just don't pay enough attention, and you will die in a ditch for your particular view of what you think is an improvement, rather than perhaps being more ecumenical, more Catholic about picking stuff.
And I think there's a thing about just sort of what a mistake a lot of founders make is they hear rightly that the best founders, the really like famous founders that we put on a pedestal, the Steve Jobs or whatever, they're stubborn. They're like, right, well, I'm going to be stubborn. Good. But it's not to be stubborn about the specific how of your solution. I'll give you a real example. So one of the biggest companies that we've been lucky enough to help to build is a company called Clio. It's a company that uses AI to give financial advice, typically to younger people. It's grown remarkably fast. It's doing about $300 million of revenue every year, but it's doubled every year for the last 5 years, which is really amazing. And the founder, Barney, had a background in NLP, but pre-Transformers, this is like a 2016 company. And the first 3 years of that company, they built a really great team of people with academic backgrounds in NLP, and they built this proprietary tech to give financial advice through a chat interface. And it was fine. It was better than fine. Like, people liked it. But Barney says the single best decision he ever made was that when GPT 3.5 came out, he ripped out all their tech and just started to make a bunch of API calls. And he's like, overnight, retention, engagement, every metric you care about doubled. And he's like, he always says every time OpenAI push an upgrade, he gets for free, well, not for free because he's paying OpenAI for it, but close to for free all these improvements. And there's a real lesson in that.
Yeah, great. So, of course, Oxford is full of researchers, and you've been scouting them, supporting them over the years. But what's your advice for them for spinning deep tech AI out of university without losing momentum or IP, given certain sorts of arrangements that some universities have in that?
Yeah. Well, I think there's a real. I spent far too much of my life in debates, to put it politely, with tech transfer officers around the country.
Yeah.
I think there's a really genuine question for AI companies in particular about what are you actually transferring? Is it IP or is it talent? And actually, a lot of the time, I think in computer science, it's not a single piece of intellectual property that you're actually spinning out. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the time, it's actually know-how, talent, networks. And I think just being really clear about what you're actually trying to do and whether it's personally, I think patents are overrated in software companies. I think if you're Google or Microsoft, then you can afford to prosecute those. And sometimes defensively, you do need them. But most of the time, I'm always slightly skeptical when I meet founders who have a company that's 30 days old and they're like, we've got 7 patents filed. I'm like, that doesn't feel to me like the way to focus, because it's really, they're going to be obsolete. It's like the speed of your iteration that really matters.
First to market.
Yeah.
You'd put that above other things. So, and I'm kind of sensing that there's you might feel that in some of the IP arrangements we have in our academic, maybe they should get out of the way a bit. I mean,
I do think that. I do think that. Well, I totally get it that if you were building in nuclear fusion and you've had like £1 billion of taxpayers' money to get to a I'm making this up, reactor design, and you want to get, clearly there's just a basic fairness arrangement there.
Yeah.
The bit I struggle with is when you've got like 2 PhD students who, have like written a bunch of papers and then have ideas about how they might apply them elsewhere. What the fairness looks like there, I think is a different calculation. And I will say, to get very vaguely political, when I compare the 2 universities I was fortunate to attend, the MIT approach of basically saying, get rich and give it back, I think is a better approach for wealth and value creation on both sides of that transaction than the way I think we've got a little bit trapped in this country.
Okay, well, that's a really interesting observation. And we'll get a little bit more political in a moment.
Oh, great.
Because I'm going to ask you about, obviously, moving on to the AI Opportunities Action Plan. So I'm interested, You have had significant roles in government, but in the Cameron government, you were tapped to lead the organisation of the Bletchley Summit and other things. Just tell us what that was like, and what are you proud of out of that?
Yeah, I mean, this was a funny thing, and you probably experienced a version of this, Nigel, where those of us who were interested in AI for a long time broadly found that government was extremely unreceptive to talking about AI for a very, very long time. And then ChatGPT happened, and suddenly, there was like a 180. I, in the summer of 2022, had just been appointed to chair ARIA, which was then brand new, and I was fortunate to be the sort of inaugural chair there. And as a result, I had a number of conversations in government about science and technology. I think a big part of Rishi Sunak's personal identity was that he was a tech guy. Like he'd spent time in California, he'd been to Stanford, and so when this moment happened, he really felt that there was an opportunity. I think he was right for the UK to define the conversation.
Yeah.
And I'd just been lucky in that for various reasons I had seen a preview of ChatGPT before it came out. And I think, with this phrase in VC that you don't know what's coming, but you do need a prepared mind. And I had a prepared mind for this. And so I slightly bluffed on both sides and sort of persuaded OpenAI that the Prime Minister really wanted to see this demo, and persuaded the Prime Minister that OpenAI really wanted to show him this demo. And as a result, this meeting between Rishi and Sam Altman happened. And I think it was a big moment for Rishi in being like, yeah, this is like a thing that is going to happen. And I think, the reality is, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, we don't have in this country UK-owned companies.
We'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about that.
And so I think for Rishi Sunak, he saw this as like, well, how does the UK win its seat at the table? And I think he felt that actually being ahead and convening was the way to do it. And so, honestly, his team asked if I would come in and do a bunch of work on setting up the sort of state capacity in this. And I was CEO of EF at the time, and I was like, I just cannot do this. But I agreed to do a bit of unpaid part-time work for them. And one thing I've learned about government is you give them an inch. And so then I got a call over the summer being like, do you want to come and be the lead negotiator for this summit along with my friend Jonathan Black, who spent a lot of time around Oxford. And honestly, at the time, I was really flattered until it became clear that the only reason they asked me was that everyone else credible would have said no, because it takes 18 months to do these summits, not 3 months. But it was an amazing experience. And although, there's been a vibe shift on safety, I do think what Rishi got really right was that actually there was a moment where policymakers felt outpaced by the tech, and they did want to actually have a conversation about what it would look like. Now, the vibe shift has meant that, a lot of that conversation has changed. And, honestly, I think that's broadly a good thing. One thing that I'm really proud of, and that I think is the sustained legacy of the summit, and that I think we can be proud of as a country, is that whatever you think about the AI safety debate, I'm definitely not a doomer at all, as you'll have seen in the action plan. I do think this idea of having state capacity to actually understand what the models and systems are capable of, and actually the norm that governments have a legitimate role in pre-deployment testing of capabilities, I think did come out of the summit, came out of the setting up of the AI Security Institute, and it's endured even though the Trump administration is less interested in that. You can read public statements from OpenAI and Anthropic about the value they've got from working with AC. And so that I think is the enduring legacy.
Okay, and the other thing on that, of course, is that, I remember back in the day, 2009, when Tim Berners-Lee and I we were advising government, we got Prime Ministerial authority, we were pushing the open data agenda, UK was leading, there was an election. We were dealing now with a coalition government. So the ideas kind of looked like they were too good to bin, and so they were kind of taken through into the coalition government. So how did you survive transition? Was it simply that, in some sense, everybody could see the net benefit? Because, from a Sunak government to Keir Starmer's, that's an interesting transition.
Yeah. Well, first thing I'd say is I do think Keir Starmer deserves a lot of credit for being really pragmatic about the issues where there's clearly big discontinuities with Rishi Sunak's approach, but being completely unprecious, untribal about saying, actually, here's stuff that we want to carry on with. So I after the summit in November 23, I stepped out, government came back to EF, and I really thought I was done, but I ended up spending quite a lot of time with Peter Kyle, who was at the time the Shadow Secretary of State for Technology. And I found in Peter someone who was genuinely just so curious about this technology. And so I just, I said, well, I'm going back to investing, but if you want to chat about it, I'm always happy to chat about it. And so then when after the election, he said, do you want to come in and do the strategy? I said, yes.
Yeah.
And, I remember...
So more time for nothing. Yeah.
Well, yeah, so my wife has pointed out that, can't really complain about being busy if you never say no. But I think the bit that they did, which I think they do deserve a lot of credit for, is they rightly, in my view, said we have to, as a country, seize the opportunities. There is a window of time where we'll have a set of advantages. But they didn't do that by trashing for AC, for example. In fact, they've refunded and double down on AC, but I think rightly it said, right, well, what does this do for ordinary people?
So let's get on to that then. So your plan was basically you got foundations, compute, data, skills, safety. And I suppose there's a large number of recommendations, all of which were accepted in some sense.
I didn't accept back that, by the way. If I'd known that, one, at the time, at the time I wrote it, there was no suggestion that it would be a prime minister-led thing.
Yeah.
It was like a DSIT doc.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, I wasn't thinking about PR.
So you get all of this stuff, you're going to sort of prove, and it's like, wow, there's a big list.
I should have done more.
But if the government could only do 3 things this year out of them, what would you pick? How do you prioritize?
That's what I'd written if I'd known he was going to announce it. Well, I think 3 things. So I think broadly it follows the 3 chapters. There are 3 chapters of the plan, and I think you could narrow them each down to 1 recommendation. So I do think that domestic compute is the new domestic energy production. It was very fashionable up until February 2022 to say, it doesn't matter whether we produce energy domestically because you just buy it on the open market. It's a commodity. And then Russia invaded Ukraine, and it turned out it does matter whether you have domestic energy production, and open markets are very susceptible to price shocks. And who knows, these days things get tariffed unexpectedly. So I think domestic compute is actually really important. And I think that's true both at the level of private sector compute, just we need more of that's physically domiciled in the UK, but also public sector compute. Something you and I talked about before is it's so important that we can do frontier AI research in academia. Well, that's really only going to happen if we invest in public domestic compute. So that would be thing 1, and we can talk about the ups and downs of getting that done, but that's thing 1. Thing 2 is I do think, and I think the Prime Minister had good instincts on this, that there is a real risk of AI to the public seeming like a tech bro thing out here. And so I think number 2 would be find some real quick wins that matter for ordinary families up and down the country. And I think there's a ton of low-hanging fruit there in public services. So, chapter 2 of and it's too many recommendations, but chapter 2 of the thing is find the ways to transform the state with AI. And, I think medium optimism about that. I think we're doing some of the right things. And then the third bit is I do believe, building on the first one, that countries that don't think about what sovereignty means in this space are going to regret that. Now, sovereignty does not mean self-sufficiency. It does not mean we need our own TSMC, we need our own ASML, we need our own OpenAI, we need our own NVIDIA. But it does mean, the definition I got to of this is, It's about access. We need to know that we will be able to run critically important workflows without anyone's permission. It's about influence. We want to have a seat at the table as this technology evolves and global governance happens. And so how do we do that? And then it's about value. I believe this technology is going to create enormous amounts of value in the world. Does any of it accrue here? That's an important question. And so I think setting up this unit that is fully focused on that with a reasonable sized budget was the third most important thing.
So, I mean, that's a nice segue into what I wanted to drill down a little bit. I mean, one of our alleged sovereign, really, jewels in our crown are various forms of data assets we have. Public or cultural data sets, open, used responsibly, could really accelerate work in this area, adoption, the kind of systems we will put out there. So how do we square this circle of keeping some kind of authentic control over that data, putting it to work in the kind of applications we might envisage, and getting the dead hands of various people who might have incumbent positions over that data off it?
Yeah. There's so much we could talk about. Let me try and be very brief. Here's what I would say. I would say, I realize I'm preaching to the choir. I'm preaching to the choir here, but like, I think the mistake that sometimes gets made in government is thinking that for a data asset to be valuable to the UK, it needs to be closed and proprietary, because otherwise it leaks. Now, obviously, at some level, it's true that if once data's open, we can't control where it's used. I think the bit that's missing in that mindset is what matters is ecosystems. And actually, I think that we're still early enough in all this that if the UK puts up a massive bat signal to the world where it says, this is the home of open data, open science, where actually the best work is going to be done, particularly in these areas that are not yet dominated by one company, AI for science, for example. I think we will attract talent and capital to places like Oxford and London and others that even if the data is open, it does matter where these people physically come. And I think we have to be the home of this. So I think there's a ton to do to like force data out of closed places. But personally, I don't think we should be precious about trying to things outside like national security or whatever. I think we should err on the side of saying the UK, particularly in the current geopolitical environment, can be the home of open science in AI.
And that's we'll perhaps come back to that, because I think I'm really interested in kind of getting a bit deeper into this kind of sovereign capability. You also talk a lot, and you mentioned this skills piece, which is how we get lots and lots, tens of thousands of AI professionals effectively trained up in the space, capable, and a broader base. I mean, it's a pyramid ultimately.
It is a pyramid, yeah.
And that's hard. I mean, what is our superpower to make this happen? How can we do it?
This is one of the things where I wouldn't say I've changed my mind, but my view has evolved. It's actually over a year since I wrote it, even though it took a very long time to get it out. I think I would now put even more emphasis on what I would call mass literacy than the tens of thousands or thousands of professionals, although I think we'll need that. I actually worry now much more that the real divide is going to come on whether you have AI literate populations or not. Because one thing that, again, to be a little bit political, I think something that's really underpriced right now is how much AI, there could be a massive populist backlash against AI over the next few years. And I think that's true even if you're somewhat bearish on AI progress. I don't think you need to believe like AGI 2027 for that to be true. Yeah. I think that's true partly because, by the way, I don't know if you've seen this, but business leaders now, when they want to make job cuts, are much happier to blame AI than like, oh, maybe we overhired. So the reason I'm saying this is I worry that if we allow AI to be set up as effectively the tool of big businesses to make cuts, to like reduce working hours, to change, then I think there will be this allergic reaction from the public, and probably rightly so. I think by far the best antidote to that is, one, make people really comfortable with what it is and what it isn't, what it can do, and ride the wave of progress gradually by being users all the time. But two, I think it's sometimes a little bit glib the way people say, like, there's this line that's become very popular of like, you won't be replaced by an AI, you'll be replaced by someone using AI. And it's like, yeah, it's sort of true. I get what people are saying, but it's more that if you as the worker know what AI can do, you can invent the next version of your own job. My worry is that right now we're building such a culture of compliance and fear from businesses. Most people I talk to in big organizations aren't allowed to use AI at work. I think this is a disaster. I think this is a huge, huge disaster. So that's what I would focus on today.
Well, that's cool. I mean, we have embraced it thoroughly here at Oxford, where we've given everybody access. Some people kind of think this is the death of learning. I think it's exactly, as you say, the opposite, because we will find ways of not just subverting, but recruiting these methods, and we will develop our own literacy. The question is, how do we get that literacy? If you're talking about the sort of populous literacy, you've got to get it into schools, you've got to get it into not just CS curricula, which are woefully underserved by big parts of the kind of, lots of boys take it, not very many girls. We need it across all of our subjects. And that requires teachers who are similarly. So it's teach the teachers, right?
It's teach the teachers, and I think it's also, I do think there is just some cultural work to do about it. Let me give you a small example. My wife is an academic, but a million miles from AI. She's a professor of ancient Greek, and she uses AI a lot in her work, probably because of who she's married to. But when she first told her colleagues, she's a professor at Warwick, they literally acted like she'd said, I use the blood of babies in my work, and it's a really useful tool for productivity. I think it's really, I don't know all your backgrounds, but it's hard to overstate the degree of fear and indeed anger about AI in a lot of the humanities in particular. I see some of that. I don't think it's the right way for the humanities to, and I know there's some really cool stuff happening in Oxford that's not like that, by the way. I know it's not universal, but I do think we need to just have role models, senior people in these fields who actually can change the story.
So you've touched on safety and the way in which actually from the Safety Institute to the Security Institute, that interesting change in vibe. Where's the UK's edge in this? Because this is going to be very consequential in the system we deploy. It's not just about acceptance and fear and potential loathing in a populace. It's also about being serious about where the threat surface is.
Yeah. So I do think this is an area where the UK is really winning. And the interesting thing is, as a sort of vaguely amusing story, I remember when we were working on the summit, Rishi Sunak was really, really keen that it didn't feel sci-fi. And that it was trying to really ground it in empirics. And as some of you will remember, he did it was technically not part of the summit, but he did this closing fireside chat with Elon Musk. This was slightly before Elon was as controversial as he is today.
We thought it was a job interview.
I'm going to be careful. Not everyone on this team thought it was a good idea. Anyway, literally the first line is she's well, we've been talking a lot about AI safety, and obviously I think for a lot of people think of killer robots, but it's not about killer robots, is it, Elon? And Elon's no, it's about killer robots. Not exactly what. Anyway, the reason I'm saying this is I actually do think what the UK has done really well is say, maybe it will become about killer robots. We shouldn't foreclose that as being a possibility, but today it's not about killer robots. Today it's about really sober, scientific, empirical evaluation of what these models can do. And the AI Security Institute went from 0 to 80 world-class AI researchers and engineers able to do that work. And one thing I would say is that I think the reputation maybe of that, maybe not of AC, but of people caring about this in 2023 was these are all doomers. The really interesting thing is, yesterday, Ken McCallum, the Director General of MI5, and in my view, one of the best public service servants this country has, gave a speech, his annual threat assessment at Thames House, and he talked about threats facing the UK, and he talked about AI, and Ken is definitely not a doomer, but he talked about how there is no doubt that even today's AI systems provide a meaningful uplift in bio and cyber capabilities of bad actors. And he called out the AI Security Institute as one of the institutions that gives the UK a right to play and win in that space and actually influence the conversation with our American friends. And so to me, AI safety, there's this like weird framing of like, oh, it's effective altruists versus effective accelerationists. It's like, it should be effective empiricists. Let's just measure this stuff and be the best place in the world to do that.
That sounds great. I mean, I absolutely think that's a really nice observation. It kind of segues again into, in your report, you talk about scan, pilot, scale. Okay, nice sense. But again, data, empirics. How do you assess the threshold at which you kind of jump from a pilot to a massive deployment, and particularly when it's in a public service? And have we even got the right delivery execution mechanisms to make that work? Yeah, I have many questions there.
It's very hard. I think like all change management, in my view, it's really important to identify quick wins that can build belief and confidence and skill. Can we do this all at once across all public services? No. Can we get quick wins? Yes. So I think the key thing is just, it's like good science in a way. Like you just need to be very clear about what is the hypothesis you're actually testing. And I do worry sometimes with AI in public discourse, there is this like, what you might call everythingism. It's like, it's going to be cheaper, faster, better for morale, better for patients, better for doctors, better for and it's like, well, maybe it would be great if it's all those things, but what is the thing that we would be satisfied if it actually was? I think a really good example of this is the work that has been publicly announced around ambient scribe in the NHS. Actually, this is a relatively quick win. Ambient scribe is simply like an AI listens to the consultation and writes you the notes. Obviously, still a doctor has to sign it off and check it, but this could be a huge win. Any of you that work in medicine or know people who do, like, doctors spend an enormous amount of their time doing this. So this is like a relative, and also it's not that hard as an AI capability. I think there is more we could do to accelerate that. I think we're rightly worried about patient safety aspects of that. But I think if we go really hard on, even in a small area, showing that this works, we choose the metrics we really care about, I think you could very rapidly get to a place where people say, oh yeah, that is just better. And if we can do it here, what's the next thing? What's the next thing?
Okay. Slightly different topic. You and I both from up north.
We are.
Regions. What's going to help all of this diffuse beyond the Golden Triangle?
Yeah. I'm really passionate about this. I'm actually, this time, next Friday, I will be in Bradford, where I'm from, for the Bradford Science Festival, where I'm doing a public talk on the state of AI, but I'm also doing a roundtable with the mayor there and local businesses about AI adoption. I think there is a huge opportunity here because, one thing that becomes very apparent if you spend any time in government is like, most of the good ideas are not in the building.
Yeah.
And I think, there's a really big opportunity right now because we have a government that's decided it really wants to make a big bet on industrial strategy. One of the things about industrial strategy, if you read the industrial strategy, is extremely regional in focus. Obviously, we have clusters all around the country. I think what we really need to do, and I sort of regret not pushing harder while I was in government, is doing a proper overlay of the industrial strategy, the AI Opportunities Action Plan by region. Because actually in Bradford, one thing I'm excited to learn next week, but I'm already learning from just pulling together the people who are going to be in the room, is there are real areas of strength there in healthcare, in retail, where Bradford could be the center of AI adoption for, say, the retail industry. You've got Asda and Morrison's headquartered within a 5-mile radius of Bradford City Centre, something like that. Okay, cool. Well, let's go really hard on that. Let's not do everythingism. Let's like pick a thing and figure out how to use local mayoral powers, central government funding and convening, but then like local industry to actually just find the actual specific wins. And not everywhere has to be everything.
Right. And just coming back before we go to questions, to this question around UK sovereign AI capability. So you say, and you argue, and I think it's a great phrase, that the UK should be an AI maker, not a taker. So which layers of the stack, what models, tooling, applied verticals, are most winnable for the UK in the next little while?
Yeah. So I think we have to take a barbell, what we call a barbell approach to this, where I think we have to be realistic that in order to accelerate the sorts of adoption that we've just been talking about, that's going to mean relying on the existing stack. And I don't think we should slow down adoption in order to, in order to not use American firms or whatever. I think that's the wrong call. I think it's really underrated how much adoption itself can shape the technology. So like one thing I think about a lot is, and a phrase I tried to coin in government, I don't think it went very far, was muscular adoption.
Right.
What is muscular adoption? Well, like OpenAI or Anthropic, they produce these incredible general purpose chatbots that I'm sure all of you use. But no one, certainly not Sam Altman or Dario Amodei, thinks that you can take Claude 4.5 and plug it into a hospital and have it run a hospital. Like, no one thinks that. And so actually, if we want to have AIs that can run a hospital, and certainly those companies do, they're going to need real partners who lean in and provide a lot of access and input and regulatory cover to do that. They can't do that themselves. The UK could be the country that says, hey, we want to have an AI native hospital or an AI native school or an AI native army base, probably not that one yet. And we're going to really lean in to be your partner on that. But by the way, in doing that, of course, that's going to bend the product roadmap and the technology roadmap of those companies. And of course, that's going to frame how they end up conceiving about what AI for healthcare looks like. And I think doing that here, I think the history of general purpose technologies, if you look at previous industrial revolutions, it's clear that adoption in the end shapes the technology more than just invention. So that's thing one. That's one end of the barbell. The other end of the barbell, I think we should be making, and I think we are making, some big bets on alternative paradigms. I think we should be willing to place, what I guess in finance you call it out of the money options, where today it looks like there's nothing, but there could be something. And one thing I'm really proud of at ARIA is we have this whole program on energy efficient compute. The goal is not take down NVIDIA, but the goal is like have some options. It may well be, it's certainly true that we can't scale energy usage in AI at the rate we have the last 10 years for the next 10 years. So we're going to need some new ideas. Now, maybe they'll come from NVIDIA, but I think the UK should absolutely have some bets on what that could look like. I think we should have some bets on non-transformer models, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, absolutely. And I think the previous fireside chat between James and William was very much, there's neurosymbolic approaches. There is this huge speciation of models anyway, not just large, ultra large, but small and medium scale models. There's contesting elements at distillation that produce models that are very nearly as capable as the very largest ones. As that commoditizes, you kind of get fixated on the notion this has all got to be massive energetically, but there could be very different ubiquitous distributions of these.
Absolutely. Well, take robotics, which I think nearly everyone agrees is not solved, but if the true ignoring Elon's killer robots, if the true promise of AI is to be realized, we're going to need big advances in robotics. And there's huge open questions about what will that mean? Is that going to be like every robot with its own like model on the edge? Is it going to be like massive centralized models in the cloud and like very low latency? We don't know. That's up for grabs. We should be making bets in that space.
Right. Okay. Back to a data issue, I guess, and it's been this kind of particular concern around our content creators. It's the issue about what is fair and workable to help unlock their material for training, rather than just, in some sense, perhaps throwing it all over the fence. And what the idea that we should, as has happened in the music industry, take more seriously those who are willing to license. And so there's a bunch of litigation out there in the US underway at the moment about that. What would you say is the right balance point here?
Yeah, I think this is like one of the hardest questions. And I was fortunate that I was not in government when the consultation on this topic in the UK went out. And so I say fortunate because I think it's obviously become a very, very challenging and sometimes toxic debate. I think the key thing for me is there is clearly a real question here, and I'm not trying to minimize it, and we're going to need to figure it out. I worry a bit that by fixating on the training sets for models that exist today, on both sides of the argument, but particularly IP holders, we're sort of missing that is like a static snapshot in time. And actually, if you look at what the future of AI looks like being, it's probably not going to be as relevant. You know, like we're looking at more and more use of, you know, like reinforcement learning, where it's not obviously using, you know, copyrighted data. It's the model is learning from human feedback or, you know, or AI feedback. It's about proprietary data in the enterprise, in an organization where obviously there'll be an agreement. And so I think there's a risk that we fight the last battle for a very long time. And whether or not rights holders win that battle, we miss the actual opportunity. And I was with a very big media organization this week with their exec team. And, you know, we were talking about this. And my sort of push to them is like, look, I don't know your business. You should do what you got to do. But if I had to advise you from an AI perspective what to do, I think the key is, what are the actual business models that will work for you in the age of AI? And like, how do you get creative, no pun intended, and get ahead of that and actually do deals on those future business models with AI companies, rather than put all your energy into this fight about what's happened? Because the truth is, I don't think there is. Let me give you an example. Like, if you are Disney, that was not the organization I was with, there are so many. Yes, maybe you should worry about the fact that OpenAI is trained on your data. I actually don't know what the status of that is. I have no idea. But it's so much more exciting to me to think about what can generative AI unlock for Disney. And the truth is, even if someone else can do that, and even if someone steals your IP, I don't mean OpenAI, I mean like someone literally just like steals it, is Disney's value really the characters, you know, as drawn? No, it's that it's Disney. It's that it's the official Disney one. It's that Disney has this distribution. Disney has this like legendary, you know, Disney will be able to build the most amazing tools and products and services that take advantage of its IP because they're Disney. It's a little bit like the fact that my kids, unfortunately, will not accept the cheaper knockoff Lego, even though it's identical. And honestly, I suspect this might be the best time in history to own IP, even if someone else is scraping it. Because actually, authenticity and distribution, I think, have so much value in an age where the cost of content creation goes to zero. That's what's going to matter. And so I totally understand the anger and the moral side of the question, but I think we need to like race forward a bit now and say what's next, rather than just what's gone.
Okay, fantastic. Well, we're going to get some questions and probably finish with a few reflections. I'm going to gather them up in threes, if that's okay. So do let me know. Just at the back and there, if we could. Yeah. So just make them short.
Yeah,
short
I'll keep it short.
Yep.
So you had about for startups, point one, fall in love with the customer, not technology. Well, if you get to Oxford, you get to the cutting edge. You get to a point where you're dealing with technology customers have never heard of. So if you're then going to found a startup based on the back of that, how do you even explain the technology to the customers? And also, what was point three of that?
Of the.
Okay, we've got that one. Yeah. Got that one. We'll come back. Yeah, we'll take that. Yeah. And next question. I'd like to gather them in trios. I think just a bit more efficient.
Yeah. So as someone that works at a tech startup, you know, I think that we, much like other tech startups in the UK, could be a UK-based company that builds a frontier model, serves it from the UK, but there are like basically insurmountable challenges to doing that, right? Data training costs, etc. Do you think that this is like an impossible dream for a small company to do, or do you think that there are pathways for that to actually happen?
Okay. Yeah. Question here on. Yes, your question. Yeah. Yeah. Just speak loudly. It does get picked up.
I read about that.
Great. Okay, the UK Startup Challenge, tech sovereignty, and that first question that we got.
Yeah. So I think the thing to remember is you don't need to explain the technology to the customer. You need to explain the value. So, and this is actually, I'm going to pretend that was going to be the third point I was going to make. This is a very, very, very common mistake that technical founders make. Your job is not to explain the technology. Your job is to say, what can it do? And your job as the founder is to map the technology to a capability. It's just like, actually, even today, all these CEOs spending, in some cases, hundreds of millions on LM implementations from Anthropic or OpenAI, they still don't know what the technology is, but they do know what it can do. So that's my point, and that's like a key thing. And not to be too commercial, but one of the things I think we're really good at EF is helping technical founders go on that journey from like technical obsession to customer obsession. Is it a pipe dream to do this in the UK? No, you can do it in the UK. I mean, one of the things that is like really underrated is capital is mobile. Like capital goes where the opportunity is, and if you have something great, you can raise capital here. You can raise it from UK investors, but frankly, you can raise it from non-UK investors. We don't have capital controls yet in this country, and long may that last. So I'm not too worried about it. I think the thing I would plug for the UK is, look, the grass is always greener. One of the problems that I hear all the time from founders in San Francisco, and we have an office there, is the challenge of building and worse, retaining a tech team, especially an AI tech team in San Francisco today, is truly insane. Like if you build a team of any quality, give it 3 months and, Mark Zuckerberg's knocking on the door and asking if they want $100 million to, So like, for better or worse, that doesn't happen here yet. And you can build, it's not about cost. Yeah, it probably is a little bit cheaper to build here than in the US, but it's more about retention. You can actually build and retain a team. Does the Silicon Valley investment help? For sure. And, I think the UK shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth. The point I was making about domestic compute is not about domestically owned compute, it's about domestically domiciled compute, and I think that's just really key. One of the things I commissioned in government was some modeling on, what will be the domestic demand and supply of compute by the end of the decade, and you're talking a gap in the high single-digit gigawatts. That is like a huge issue, and you can believe different things about latency and whether it will matter to have it domestically, but at minimum, there's just a bunch of data sovereignty questions and sort of physical control that kick in, I think, pretty early. But yeah, it's not sufficient. I think it's as important to think about how do we make other countries at least somewhat reliant on our technology as it is to ask about how reliant we are on others. I think the key here is to be mutually dependent with our friends and partners. And to me, no one, including the US, is going to achieve self-sufficiency in this technology. That would be, I think that would be neither possible nor desirable. But the question is, are you part of the solution at all? Are you part of that value chain at all? And I think if you're not, you're going to have big problems.
More questions? Yes, at the back and on the side here, and the third to join that. Yes.
Hello, hi. I'm Eng Han, the founder and CEO of Tetmon. We provide data integration, data sovereignty solutions to governments and banks in Asia, and we are looking to expand to the UK. So from yesterday, we heard a lot about AI sovereignty. So my question is that Singapore is in a unique position between the East and the West, and we have that fortunate or unfortunate circumstance where even though we are parliamentary elections, we have the ruling party being in place for the past 60 years. So my question is that, Matt, previously you were assisting the government, and now we have a new AI minister. So how would UK ensure the continuity of the AI sovereignty throughout the change in government? Because one way is maybe to have the Crown actually having that oversight for the long term.
Yeah, question here.
Yeah, so Yoshi Sornak, I work with a company called Glees, a global construction firm. One of the biggest issues that businesses are having is the ability to engineer context within their systems. And one of the best frontier labs that do this are Anthropic. But currently, we don't see many UK residency for our data in Anthropic, and a lot of it is to do with Microsoft and Google. Equally, they're kind of, from an observer's perspective, leading on a lot of alignment research. So it's kind of synergistic with what you're doing here for the UK, but also in those connections with America. Do you think there's a quick win in being able to better leverage the models through Anthropic?
To better leverage Anthropic?
Yeah.
Okay, that's that question. And then a question here. You can shout out if you like. Yeah. Okay, right, there we go. So Singapore.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time in Singapore, and we had an EF office in Singapore for many years, and there's a huge amount the UK could learn from Singapore. Look, I don't think you can assure continuity of strategy in a democracy, certainly not one like the UK. I think what you can do is figure out what are the I think the best ways to do that are probably three things. One is, I think you need business to speak with one voice on what they need, or maybe not one voice, but I think it needs to be very, very clear, like why this matters for the UK. And I think in general, you tend to see continuity on these things that have a kind of deep underpinning in economic growth. Second, I think to slightly preempt the third question, I do think figuring out what are the national security implications of this technology and what is the underpinning investment in infrastructure that's needed for that is absolutely critical. And that also tends to build continuity. But then third, I think you've got to deliver value for ordinary people. Like, I think, the biggest risk to continuity in policy on this is if it is seen as a fad or like a narrow sectional win for a small number of people or a handout to tech bros. And so I think really it's like we have a short window of time to show that actually the big investments that the country is making or will make in this technology pay off for ordinary people. And if we don't do that, then we will rightly risk the public saying, well, let's prioritize elsewhere. Maybe I'll come to your question just because it fits from that. I think, in terms of the quick wins, like I think one thing I think about a lot is that everyone always says that government's terrible at technology, and maybe that's fair. But something that people is almost like viral in how good it is like when you renew your passport or driving license online. Has anyone done that recently? Kind of amazing, right? It's like a 5, and it just works. And I just think we need to find the AI equivalent of that. I have some ideas about what that could be. I think there's a bunch of things around tax, where we have a lot of people who have to fill in self-assessment, but actually don't have very complicated tax returns. I think that's like a thing where actually it's quite structured, and you could build some stuff on that. So I think something like that. But I actually think the best one is ambient scribe. I think if we do that really well in the NHS, I think it unlocks so much goodwill, because it's one of the areas where we have both a service provider that it's incentives compatible with. It's not like doctors want to spend ages writing out their notes, but it also just makes life better for patients. So there was another part of your question. What it was? Regulatory. The government in its manifesto says there's going to be an AI bill. Clearly, there hasn't been an AI bill in this session. Maybe there'll be one in the next session. If there is, maybe it will look at regulation. I'd be very surprised, just based on what's out there publicly, if there wasn't a big emphasis on the growth side of AI in that. I think broadly, if you were to survey people in the labs and in AC privately, they would say, actually, the regime is working pretty well right now. Voluntary commitments plus state capacity. Again, speaking purely for myself, I'd be surprised if people wanted to massively rock the boat on that. Should we do more with Anthropic? Probably. I mean, I can't speak for Anthropic. I spent a lot of time in government working with Anthropic on various things. And I think we have announced an MOU between the government and Anthropic to work on various agentic services in government. And I think great things will come out of that. Anthropic already have its second biggest office in London, and I think they're expanding fast there. So, I'm sure we'll see more.
Okay, we're very close to our finish point. So I'm going to take Chair's privilege of just kind of asking a couple of wrap-up questions that I think you have to get off pretty swiftly.
Unfortunately, I do, yeah.
Unfortunately, but it might be available for a quick couple of follow-ups. So one thing perhaps we haven't touched on quite as much is the whole issue of alignment, ethics, what that actually means. There's been a kind of rather the view that various forms of consequentialism or utilitarianism, effective altruism, these models have gained ascendancy in how we think about what we do with these models. But there's, as you yourself have said, you recommend that lots of other ways of thinking about ethics, from virtue ethics to social contract models. Is this, where is this in the plan, if you like, coming back to your original humanities interest? Where do we get that kind of profound thinking around the sorts of fundamental frameworks and guidelines we need?
Yeah, I mean, I like to think that we're really early in this whole thing, and that my kids will look back on this as the extraordinarily primitive period where we're sort of feeling our way around in the dark. And the consequence of that, I think, is I do worry. One of the things I worry most about there being such a dominance of within the AI community, particularly in frontier labs, around short timelines, and the idea that it's actually not early, in some ways it's late, is that I worry it shuts down prematurely a diversity of thought around answers to that question. I think we're going to need a ton of work on thinking about what frameworks we want to use in a world where human-machine and machine-to-machine interactions are a way bigger part of both the economy and society as a whole. I'm really excited about some of the work that's being done on that. I think all the frontier labs have some interesting work in the space. I know there's some great work happening in Oxford on it. But I kind of feel like the most important thing is that we don't shut down any paths on that. And, I think, Anthropic would be the first to say it's probably not true that like constitutional AI is the beginning and end of the story. And, clearly RLHF wasn't the beginning and end of the story. And I just would strongly encourage people, particularly in academia. I think this is one of the ways that there's a lot of talk about whether academia is relevant in AI. I think absolutely is relevant in AI, even without access to 250,000 GPUs or whatever. And I think this is one of the areas where there's incredibly fruitful work that can be done.
Yeah, perhaps I haven't probed that enough. I like to think we're a bit relevant, but because I think there's a lot of innovation, partly driven by, scarcity is the mother of invention.
So important. So important.
And just a final point, from your sense and your background, your backstory, you are inherently an optimistic individual. And despite various storm clouds, why do you remain so optimistic about this next early primitive stage that it might be, next stage? I think we have a duty partly to be optimistic in the roles we have, but actually, where's your evidence?
Yeah, well, let me try and make a very, very brief argument for two kinds of optimism. So, and there's an optimism for the world, point. I think it's very easy sitting in 2025, especially here in this beautiful building in a place like Oxford, and just sort of imagine that the world is livable and wealthy and flourishing is possible because that's just the nature of things. That's not the nature of things. It's extraordinary if you look at a chart of global GDP. If you zoom out more than a couple of centuries, it's the the Hobbes line of, life being nasty, violent, brutish, and short was true for nearly all of human history. And then the Industrial Revolution happened, and gradually, and then suddenly it stopped being the case that was inevitable. And the only reason that's true is because of technology. And so I think you just gotta say there's lots of scary things about technology, but technological progress is the only thing that's made life what we want it to be. That's my optimism for the world. We're gonna have to navigate life. Optimism for the UK is I don't want to be too Donald Trump about this, but we do have to make the UK great again. I mean, I think really there is, it is an extraordinary moment of pessimism for this country in the media, actually in political life. And I honestly think it's ludicrous. I think this country built the modern world. Yes, it did some things along the way that we shouldn't be proud of, and I'm not one of those people that wants to gloss over those things, but so many of both the technologies, but also the values that I think most of us would want to be in the world were invented in this country. And the idea that we can't do that again is absurd. We're sitting in one of the great national assets of this country, the fact that people from all over the world want to come here. So many of the modern inventions in AI were invented in this country. And, people like Demis Hassabis built DeepMind in this country. And there is absolutely no reason why we cannot do that again. The single biggest barrier to us doing that is telling ourselves that we can't, and therefore having to go elsewhere to do it. Let us not do that.
That's a great note to end on. Let's give it up for...
Thank you. You are an expert interviewer. It's amazing.